Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
You're listening to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Tyler Alderson, and this week we are talking to an author who's written many books, too many books to list right here. The most important one for today is Philip and Alexander, which is a really interesting history of two very intriguing individuals, Alexander the Great and his father, both of whom did a lot in their lives. Adrian Goldsworthy, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I mentioned all of these books that you have written before. I should mention that all of those books that you wrote before, you had some novels that were set during the Napoleonic Wars. Otherwise, both fiction and nonfiction, you focused primarily on Rome. And so now you set your sights a few hundred years before to Philip and Alexander. What took you in that direction, and how was it jumping outside of your normal field?
Well, I'm one of those historical butterflies, really. I can get interested in almost anything. So you visit a place and you start thinking, oh, yeah, that would be interesting. I ought to read about that, whether it's medieval history or more recent. I've always stuck with the Romans because that's what I know. And people have kept saying, could you do us a book on this? Or I've thought, hey, that's a good idea. There isn't a good accessible biography of Caesar or Augustus, so let's have a go at that. With Philip and Alexander, the publishers actually asked me to write this book, and I thought about it. If they'd asked me to write a book just on Alexander the Great, I would have said no, because I think there are just too many and it's churning over the same ground again and again. But because they said do Philip as well, I thought, well, actually, that's interesting because he tends to get ignored. Nobody remembers how much he changed Macedonia and the world around it, and how far everything Alexander did depended wholly on what Philip had achieved. So the thought, yes, tell the two stories, look at the two men. That's actually a new light on Alexander as well, or a fresh light as regards a popular audience. I mean, scholars, academics who work on the period, they take a lot of this for granted, but they forget to explain to everybody else. And it's explaining, it's trying to look at these characters from history, these names from history, as if they were more recent people, and write a biography in that way, in the same way that I've done of some of the Romans. So it was a challenge. It was a bit of a shift for me. It's going back to things that I hadn't really looked at and thought about since I was a student almost, or sometimes teaching in my early days as a lecturer. So it was nice. It was refreshing. It is a bit of a shift and a shock, but it's nice to do, and it's made me. I've actually signed up to write another book on Greek history after the next book because I thought there's a gap. There was something I wanted to refer to in my early chapters of the sort of the background to Philip's life, and there wasn't a good accessible book about it. So I thought, okay, let's see if I can write one in a few years.
And you mentioned that too, about just how many books have been written about Alexander. I thought that, again, focusing on Philip was so interesting because he hasn't gotten that same treatment. But you referenced in the book about, I think it was a Colin Farrell movie from a while ago. I mean, this is a pop culture figure as much as he is a historical figure. How much did you have to, push against that while you were doing the research, and really work around that framework that we see him in?
It's interesting because I encountered the same thing earlier on when I did books on Julius Caesar, and then I did the book on Antony and Cleopatra. And because of Shakespeare and because of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton and the great Cleopatra movie, we've got it in our minds that Mark Antony is the young lover of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar's the old man. But Mark Antony's in his 50s when he commits suicide, so he's well into middle age. But in our minds, it's young against old, and it's the same with Philip. In the sort of popular memory where he's remembered at all, it's as the old man, one-eyed, limping, who almost needs to die before Alexander can go off and do his stuff. So it's trying to tell people, just remind them of the obvious, that Alexander, like anybody else, has a father, that because he inherits the throne of Macedon from his father, that father's been significant, and then look at the detail and tell the story of Philip. But it is, you have to remind people all the time that Philip wasn't always in his 40s and limping and one-eyed, and that when he became king, he was only about 21, and he was the young, dashing, handsome, and largely unproven hero. So it's, as with a lot of these things, it's just trying to remind people that everyone has had a life before this. It isn't just, the world isn't waiting for Alexander to mount Bucephalus and charge off and go and do these great conquests. So it is, as I say, I can't take credit for thinking of the idea because it was the publishers who asked me to write this one. But it makes so much sense that you start thinking, well, why hasn't this been done before?
You hear Alexander the Great, and another thing that really pops out, of course, is that we don't have that many people who are called the Great out there. I think you mentioned Charlemagne and Alfred the Great, and maybe a few others later. But he is such a towering figure. And yet, especially early on in the book, you paint a picture of Macedonia as just this area that goes through king after king, that has all kinds of problems, not necessarily the center of the ancient world. And Philip has a lot to do with changing that.
Oh, it makes a huge difference. I mean, it's always been potentially a wealthy kingdom. It's got a different, more continental European climate to southern Greece. It's got great resources in terms of minerals, precious metals, particularly timber, the forests that gave you the wood you needed to build ships, to build the big monuments that we think of now. We only see the stone. We forget the beams that were in the ceiling, the wood that was needed for the scaffolding, all the essential roles played by the perishables. But it's striking that if you look at Philip's early life, he's a hostage for several years in the Greek city of Thebes. Now, you can't imagine Alexander ever having been a hostage. When he inherits and becomes ruler of Macedon, two of his brothers, his two older brothers, have both died violently, one by an assassin's knife, the other fighting a battle against the Illyrians and losing it, along with his own life and half his army. So it's such a contrast. The shock, and that's only just over 20 years before Alexander will start his great career and go off to conquer Persia, the superpower of the world. So it is that incredible transition from Philip, who can inherit, become king of Macedonia. It probably wasn't a big news story for most people in the wider Greek world, let alone beyond Macedonia, that, hey, there's a new king in Macedonia, because they just don't last long. And Philip's family tend to die violently, very often at the hands of their nearest and dearest, or at least close family. So Macedonia has been picked on by its neighbors, whether they're the Thracians, the Illyrians, the more tribal peoples, or whether they're the city-states of southern Greece. It's never been a strong independent power. And in the course of a couple of decades, Philip can change things so that not only is Macedonia bigger, wealthier, more powerful, it dominates southern Greece, and it's in a position to say, we can actually attack Persia, we can take on the greatest power in the known world.
And I know that there is, that there are some kind of modern politics implications for some of this. But what struck me in reading about this was that Macedonia was, it seems to have been kind of both Greek and not. It was Greek in many ways, but it was definitely a different culture than a place like Athens or Sparta, which is what everybody's mind jumps to when you think ancient Greece.
And it's partly because essentially the Athenians wrote the story of Greece as we have it. So we get very much the view of the Athenian aristocrat when it comes to considering ideas of Greek culture, Greek society. But there's a nice story from Herodotus, the first Greek historian, the first really historian in world history, certainly Western history, that Alexander the First, ancestor of Philip and the Alexander we talk about, wanted to enter the Olympic Games, and they actually had a debate as to whether or not a Macedonian prince counts as a Greek or not. And in the end, because his family claimed descent from exiles from the city of Argos, very definitely in southern Greece, that's all fine and legitimate, he gets allowed in. Philip can compete. He can have chariots and horses racing in the Olympic Games. There's no question about whether they're Greek or not. By that time, it's changed. But early on, and that first Alexander actually gets nicknamed the Philhellene, the lover of Greece, or Greek ideas, Greek culture. So if you're called the Philhellene, it suggests that people aren't automatically assuming you're a Greek in the first place. So they're sort of bored. They're not quite as barbarous as the the Thracians or the Illyrians or the very different peoples beyond that who speak different languages. The Macedonians speak a dialect that is clearly Greek, but they don't develop the city-state that is the sort of quintessential Greek social and political idea. So they're seen as backward. They have kings. That's pretty backward. And they don't develop the political institutions that the Greeks consider so important. And that has all sorts of implications. They don't, as a result, develop the sort of army that a Greek state has. The hoplites that, obviously the Spartans out there were the best, but the strength of every city-state's force was its hoplite militia of propertied citizens. Macedonia just doesn't have that culture. It doesn't have that society. It doesn't produce that sort of army. So it's just different. And because the hoplites and those sorts of soldiers had dominated the battlefield, and because some of the city-states had a measure of greater internal stability, at least for a while, Macedonia seems very weak in comparison to these big southern Greek states like Athens, like Sparta, like Thebes, even Corinth and some of the lesser ones.
And that is another thing that I think was fascinating. You read about Alexander being this military sort of wonderkind, and he's going out and conquering. I mean, he ended up conquering pretty much everyone, it seemed. But Philip was an amazing military mind, and actually seems to have made a lot of advancements, even technologically speaking, with the armies that he inherited versus what he ended up handing off to Alexander.
Well, he has to fight from the very start of his reigns, because obviously Philip inherits because his brother's just been killed in battle by the Illyrians, the Macedonian army routed. So he has to, over the course of the next few months, not only fight off a couple of rivals from his own family who want to take the throne from him, but create an army that will be able to take on an enemy that's just beaten you. And it's always hard, people get used to losing, they get used to winning. So it starts a process that's very difficult to pin down as to precisely when all these reforms happen. But from the beginning, it is the creation of this balanced army that's unlike anything ever seen before. And up until now, Macedonia has been thought of as producing good cavalrymen but terrible infantry. And even if you equip them with hoplite equipment, as one of the predecessors, one of the Macedonian kings had tried, doesn't make any difference. They still fail. They don't have that culture. Philip changes. The hoplites are spearmen. He predominantly uses a spear that's held one-handed, maybe about 7-8 feet long, and he stands side by side with his fellows, rank after rank in a phalanx, but he fights very much as an individual. Philip gives his men, his Macedonian peasants, the sarissa, which is a two-handed pike, twice the length of a spear, sometimes up to 18 feet long. Has to be held in two hands. Your shield is pretty much strapped to your left arm and is much smaller than the hoplite shield that gives him his name. And obviously, a pike is not something that's very good to fight when you're an individual. It's got to be used as a group, everybody standing close together, presenting lots of pike heads thrusting towards the enemy. And then it keeps the enemy at a distance, and you can jab at him, and it's very difficult for him to get at you. So Philip, at first, uses a weapon that's simple, that's crude, that's cheap, but helps his men to fight as a group. They don't have to be individually that skillful. But over the years that follow, he develops an army. The army trains more and more. The pikemen become better drilled, able to start doing sophisticated maneuvers. They turn into very experienced, very almost professional soldiers. They're certainly nearly full-time soldiers, and they're paid, so they can campaign all the year around as long as Philip can supply them. And he adds elite infantry. He keeps the cavalry that they've always had, keeps them high quality, makes them better, but makes them more numerous. And then he tacks on all sorts of allies from the tribal peoples to the north and mercenaries and allies from southern Greece. And in time, Alexander will take this army further on and he'll add horse archers from the steppes, he'll add Persian troops, Eastern troops, Indian troops, all sorts of local allies. But you add them on to this core that is really Philip's army, and the army that Alexander takes to attack the Persians is almost entirely composed of Philip's men. Many of them already middle-aged. They've campaigned for 20 years or more with Philip, and they've got used to winning, and they've got used to marching. And Philip wins because he surprises people. He turns up unexpectedly. He'll march hard, he'll march fast. You're shocked when he arrives, you're not ready. He also, on the battlefield, creates a force that doesn't just have good heavy infantry, as a hoplite Greek army has. It's got good cavalry, good light infantry, as well as good heavy infantry. It's always got something the enemy doesn't have that gives it an advantage, and they fight very well together as a team. The third and most striking revolution, really, in warfare that Philip creates is one that's easy to forget because it's less dramatic. We always focus on the big pitched battles, but Philip and Alexander fought only 4 or 5 of these each in their lifetimes. What they did most of was sieges, taking fortified positions. And Philip starts by hiring technical experts, engineers from all over the Greek world. He gives them money to research. They start designing new forms of artillery, new forms of other siege engines, siege towers, ramps, these sorts of things. And he's determined enough to besiege a city and take it by assault, which sometimes means accepting quite heavy casualties in the process, but you get a result. Greek armies tend to blockade a city and hope it would starve, or somebody inside would decide that you were going to win, so they'd betray the city to you. Philip starts taking cities. He and Alexander fail once or twice, but more often than not, they take every city they surround and try to capture. And that means that the wars they fight are much more permanent than warfare in the past, because essentially your enemy becomes either your property and your subordinate ally, or you remove them as a political institution. You can destroy the city and pull the walls down. So it means you're not going back and fighting the same opponents year after year, generation after generation, as many Greek states would do. So that added, far more decisive element to warfare is a huge change. And it's one of the reasons why the Macedonians can conquer so quickly and hold on to what they've gained.
And that's something as well that was so fascinating to see. And I'd imagine that this was something that so many people had not seen before, in the sense that they were able to move and adapt. One of the things that Alexander, is so known for is, going to Egypt, going to Persia, moving onward, having to adapt to those situations. And you do get the sense, at least from reading the book, that he could not have done, if he was just Alexander, the next king of Macedonia, as there had been kings before. He would not have had nearly the same capabilities, with him, that he had once Philip had changed Macedonia so drastically from what it had been.
Oh, yes, it's for almost until the end of Alexander's life, he is essentially leading Philip's army, commanded by Philip's officers, consisting of Philip's former soldiers, the hardcore of it, the Macedonians, and fighting in exactly the same way they fought under Philip. They face some new problems, they adapt to them, but it's the same speed of movement, rarely stopping for long over the winters, keeping on campaigning, always attacking, very aggressive, always going to the sort of the enemy's heartland and taking their strongholds. And if they fight you in the open, fine, you beat them in the open. But if they go and hide behind city walls or hide in the mountains, you go and chase them there. So it's a very relentless form of campaigning, and that's Philip's creation. Nobody had done this before, certainly in Europe, and and Middle Eastern warfare as well tended to be a bit more staid, a bit more processional. There was a sense of the great king would go to war, and it was a big spectacle, and he would do these things. But there hadn't been an army that fought in this way that anyone could remember. But some of Philip's officers were generals like Parmenio that Alexander will eventually kill. This is a man in his 70s when the war with Persia is going on. These are incredibly experienced soldiers, and it means that nearly everybody within the army is very used to who's in charge, who commands the unit that's going to be on our right, who's going to be on our left. They know how it works. And they're a very practiced team. There's that human element as well as the sort of the institutional tactical changes that Philip brings on. He bonds them together, and they get used to winning, they get used to working together, and they are very efficient. But there's also the thing that's so easy for us to forget. We tend to look at it and think, oh yeah, this is this wonderful military revolution, then along comes Alexander, who's a military genius. They're just bound to go on winning. there were plenty of
And
people who were still alive when Alexander died who could remember the time when Macedonia was an unimportant non-entity of a kingdom on the fringes of Greece that was, always being attacked by its neighbors, always being picked on. Its royal family was murdering each other all the time. That wasn't that long ago. It's within living memory. So it's more of a shock that how on earth have these people conquered most of the world?
well, that's one of the things that I also got from this. Whenever you're looking at history, it is so easy to think that what happened was always going to happen, and certainly this book blows that out of the water in so many ways. First of which was that Philip was what, the third or fourth choice in terms of, as you say, some of his brothers had the throne before him. So if one of them had managed to survive, he wouldn't have necessarily been able to touch it. But also then, he died at the relatively young age of 46, and so Alexander might not have, been able to take over in the same way that he did at such a young age. How was it when you were going through this to work against that idea that, well, Alexander the Great was just he was just bound to be this iconic figure rather than the product of some very interesting twists and turns?
It's one of those things I try when I write a book like this to, as far as you possibly can, just to sort of step back and say, well, look, let's tell the story. And it's one of the advantages of old-fashioned narrative chronological history. If you start at the beginning, so if you're writing a sort of biography of someone, it's basically when they're born, and then follow what they do at each stage in their life, and don't assume that, when Abraham Lincoln's parents sort of have a baby, they think, oh yeah, that guy's going to be president, he's going to be important. Nobody knows this is going to happen just because these names that become so famous. It helps that when, for instance, I've read a biography of Julius Caesar. Caesar, the name becomes so important that we still have a Kaiser and a Tsar at the beginning of the 20th century in Europe as the heads of two of the great powers. But it's only a family name. It's like being called Smith or Jones or something like that. And you have to try and remind yourselves of these little things. And it helps you, if you think back that when Caesar was young, when Alexander was just starting out, nobody knew what they were going to do. So it's going back to that chronological thing and telling the story and then trying to think, well, people are making decisions. They don't know what's going to happen. Someone like Alexander clearly had immense self-confidence and was convinced they were going to do all these wonderful things. Philip probably much the same. Philip had a harder time of it because he inherited such a weak kingdom. And as you say, he's the youngest of three brothers, both of whom have to get killed before he becomes king. But there's at least another three brothers from half brothers rather, because Macedonian kings are polygamous. And there's no fixed rule that the eldest son of a particular wife should inherit. So he faces all these rivals, and in the course of his life, he'll kill them all. But there's that element that, this could easily not have happened. But then both Philip and Alexander fight a lot of battles, a lot of skirmishes, and they lead from the front. Both take a lot of wounds. Now, you can argue that there's some exaggeration in, the dangers that they face, but, Philip gets shot in the face, loses the use of one eye. He gets stabbed through the thigh and the leg, limps permanently. They both get scars. Alexander gets hit. He's shot by an arrow in India, suffers a serious wound there and collapses. So any of those blows, any of those moments, had the blow been a little bit stronger, had it been aimed just a fraction to the left, to the right, Philip or Alexander might have died very young in battle and been forgotten. So luck plays a role, chance plays a role, as it does in all our lives. And that's, I think, in the end, it's trying. These people are famous, and Alexander, particularly, obviously, is still famous after all these centuries. But trying to remind everybody that when we write about them, we are writing about human beings, much like ourselves. Products of different cultures, certainly. They might have different attitudes, different assumptions. This is a world that, for instance, accepts slavery as perfectly normal. Things that are very alien to us. But basically, they are human beings. And a lot of the emotions and their experience. There's another terrible tendency that historians are prone to, and archaeologists even more so, is to talk of a couple of years as in a short period of time this happened, this trend, or in a couple of years they overran this country. Well, our own lives are lived day by day and hour by hour. And so were people's lives in the past. You've got to try and remind yourself that what seems like a short time because you've just mentioned dates of a couple of years is still a long, long time in human experience, and try and make this seem real, because it was real. This was what people were living, and it's the stories of all those individuals that make up the events of this time. So I think if you add that human element, it helps you to remember that I didn't know 30 years ago that I was going to be doing this interview, that I was going to be writing books or anything like that. Things just happen in life. So much is chance, so much is good fortune or bad fortune. And that's just as true in the 4th century BC as it is today.
Well, that's has to be a big point right now. I mean, it's only been what, 6 months, 7 months since March, since a lot of these lockdowns took place. It's probably felt like about 7 years. So definitely a couple of years can change dramatically. As we've even seen more recently.
Yes, exactly. I mean, generally speaking, if you live in the West in the 21st century, your life is pretty secure. But along comes coronavirus, and it's a reminder that, well, it need not be. In the same way that, for an individual, if you suddenly get diagnosed with cancer or any other serious condition, your life can change in the moments of being given that news. Human existence is precarious. The world is, life is like that. Accidents can happen. You can be in a car smash any day. The ancient world was probably that much more dangerous. Although, again, a striking thing that quite surprised me, because you don't really see it in the Roman period, is the number of very elderly people who still play an important political role in this period. You've got generals like Parmenio in their 70s. Quite a lot of Philip and Alexander's family, if they didn't get killed, they tend to live to a ripe old age. And the Illyrian king who's killed Philip's brother is pushing 80. There's a Spartan king of a similar age who's might not be that active, but he's actually leading an army on campaign, even if he's staying at the back. So there's some tough old birds out there in this time that reminds us that you could beat the odds. Yes, low life expectancy in many respects, lots of risks of diseases, but on the other hand, some people seem to manage it.
Well, low life expectancy, you talk about Macedonian kings, they did seem to have a very low life expectancy. And ultimately, even though he beat the odds in terms of the length of his reign, Philip II does end up succumbing to what happens to so many Macedonian kings before him, which is an assassination under kind of, there's some controversy in the historical record there.
Well, that's the thing. It's simple in one sense, in that it's well recorded who the assassin was, a man called Pausanias, and that even Aristotle vouches for the fact that he has a personal grudge because he'd one time been Philip's favorite and lover. Philip ditches him for another young man of the same name. The first Pausanias humiliates this chap, who then goes off and gets himself killed heroically in battle to prove his courage. And then years later, a friend of the man who died gets Pausanias drunk, and then he and the companions at dinner beat him up. They might rape him. He's given to the muleteers and the servants, who do gang rape him. And then when the poor young man goes to Philip to say, look, this is terrible, I want recompense, I want justice, Philip does a typical sort of politician's response. The man who did this is too important. He's the ward of Philip's latest bride, and he's just too powerful. So Philip gives that man a command, but sends him off to Asia Minor with the advance guard of the big expedition, and then promotes Pausanias to be one of his 7 bodyguards, which is a very prestigious role for somebody quite young. But it's not enough for Pausanias, who broods, and then at Philip's moment of great triumph, when he's walking into the theatre to general acclaim, Pausanias runs up, stabs him. Philip dies almost instantly. Pausanias runs off, trips before he can get to his getaway horses, and is stabbed to death by the other bodyguards before he can say anything. So you know the assassin, but who's behind it? Alexander's accusing the Persians of paying for this and arranging it somehow because Philip had begun this war against them. But obviously, the big rumors at the time is that it's Alexander's involved in some way, or his mother, Olympias, still Philip's wife, but everyone believes that she and Philip had come to loathe each other bitterly. And perhaps there's concern about Alexander's future, but not immediate concern. But the problem with the sort of mystery surrounding the murder is that there's so many details we don't know. You know, we don't actually know whether Philip was planning on taking Alexander with him on his Persian expedition or leaving him behind. So was he about to be sidelined, left to sort of govern Macedonia, or was he going to go off and have his chance to win great glory in the Persian expedition as Philip's subordinate, but nevertheless an honored one? And then you start getting into all sorts of judgments. Well, could Alexander have been complicit in the murder of his father? We just don't know enough about the man's character to know one way or the other. Olympias gets a lot of very harsh verdicts passed on her by our ancient sources because she plays a very prominent role after Alexander's death. She raises armies, leads them in battle, she murders rivals and opponents or has them executed, is thought of as particularly ambitious, ruthless, and murderous, which is pretty much true of anybody in the Macedonian royal family, but it always seems worse seeing those traits in a woman if you're a Greek observer. And even to some extent the Romans, particularly the Greeks, are horrified by the idea of violence committed by women. So Olympias is clearly a nice figure to blame. She's also a good figure to blame if you're very keen on Alexander. You can say that, oh, well, he was all right, he wasn't involved, it was just his wicked mother, and blame it on the sort of, the mad wife who's just angry and full of rage. I mean, the whole episode has this sort of odd soap opera quality about it, in the sense of the thought that it's this very traumatized young man who kills Philip. The one thing we can say is that Philip dying at that time is incredibly lucky for Alexander, which comes back to those turns of fate, the chance that we were talking about a few minutes ago. Alexander inherits a war with Persia that hasn't really begun. It started, but it hasn't got going yet. Philip hasn't yet led the main expedition across into Asia Minor. Alexander has put in charge of this incredible army that's better than anything else around. He's got a kingdom that's now far stronger than it was when Philip inherited behind him. And he's got the purpose of this great war, the great expedition of, it seems a little odd to us, taking revenge on the Persians for their invasion of Greece more than a century before. But nevertheless, it was a great cause. It was a great adventure. And, when you're 23, this is a pretty great opportunity, particularly for somebody as ambitious as Alexander. So he certainly benefits the most, whether that necessarily meant that he had anything to do with it and pushed events in that direction, or simply as the opportunist. Like, again, most successful leaders, they're very good at taking the opportunities that come to them and taking advantage of those turns of fortune. Alexander certainly does that, just as he will with everything else in his career. He is not someone who's slow to seize an opportunity.
Don't they say that luck is what happens? What is it when preparation meets opportunity, or something like that? There's some turn of phrase around that.
Yes. Oh yeah, can't remember off the top of my head. But yes, it's the same, and it is. Every successful leader is an opportunist, because if you can't seize those chances, you're probably not going to get them again. And in Alexander's case, he's proclaimed king within hours of Philip's death. He quickly bumps off a few rivals, or potential rivals, and the man who's been responsible for the humiliation of Pausanias and is the ward, the uncle of Philip's most recent wife, he's ordered killed. And the wife and the infant child, not quite sure whether it's a boy or a girl, of that latest wife of Philip II is also killed, though Olympias is sort of blamed for that in the sources. Whether that's true or not is another matter. So, but on the other hand, even if he had no idea that his father was going to get killed, if he didn't seize the opportunity and become king, then somebody would have murdered him to get the throne. So, this is a dog-eat-dog world, and you can't hang around. So, but then nobody's ever going to accuse Alexander of hesitating at any stage in his life. And it's not his personality. This is, the whole sort of spirit, and it's partly a public image, but it is of this young man who just can't wait to get going, who has boundless energy, who just charges off and always plunges into the thick of things, but always works it out because he's just got that talent, he's got that strength, he's got that skill, and he's got that luck.
And you've mentioned a few times just some of the, I guess, the issues or some of the reading between the lines that you have to do with the sources, and everything, reading through the book, it paints in some regards a kind of a Hobbesian portrait of so many of the the interactions. And I mean, there does seem to be a lot of killing of this person or that person for various political reasons. Even people, as you say, like children that normal people would definitely frown upon. We in the West see Alexander often as this very heroic, epic figure. He's the golden boy. Persia is the big bad of of Greece, and they invade, and they're often the evil people there. Obviously, there are shades of gray everywhere. If you go over to Persian literature, it's very different. Alexander becomes the villain. How was it to work with those sources and to work not only just with the the day to day and the facts that you have to look at, but as you say, a lot of the colorations that come about from these various writers after the fact and how they build the narrative around Alexander?
It's in part, the problem begins with Alexander because he is getting people at court to write his own history that as the events occur. So, it's obviously painting him in a more and more flattering light. And it's quite interesting. The Emperor Augustus later on comments that he didn't want court historians like Alexander because in the long run they praise him so much they make him look ridiculous. But obviously, Alexander, by ancient standards, went off and conquered so much that this is generally seen as, yes, clearly he's great because he's done all of this. Nobody else conquers so much so fast. It's a very different problem. I mean, it is part of the job description, really, of being an ancient historian, is that you are dealing with sources that never tell you all you need to know, and that are often inadequate, often have huge gaps in them. There are quite a few years in Philip II's life where we don't know where he was and what he was doing, particularly when he's not doing anything in relation to southern Greece. It's mostly the Greeks, it's the Athenians that wrote things down. If he goes off and fights the Illyrians or the Thracians, southern Greeks didn't really care much about that. They weren't interested. Alexander, we nearly always, with one or two exceptions when he's in what's now Afghanistan and that area, we nearly always know where he was, what he was doing, down to a month or so either side, much closer, but we certainly know what he's doing every year. I try throughout to be honest because people tend to forget, because it's convenient to forget, that nearly all the sources for Alexander, and they are much fuller than the ones for Philip, were written down over 400 years after Alexander's death. So, if you just think how far 400 years from today takes us back and think, well, if suddenly now all we had to go on for those periods were what was written now, you get some idea of the difficulties, because particularly in Alexander's case, the legend has shaped itself. And, you mentioned the Persian tradition, and there is this one very clear one that comes from the Zoroastrian side, where he is the evil defiler of fire temples and all this sort of thing. But weirdly, you also get later on the sort of romantic view where Alexander becomes a hero. And that also goes through in Iranian tradition. So people get, there are different trends and different strands to the story. But as a historian, you have to go and see what we've got in terms of evidence, and overwhelmingly, the evidence is from literature, supplemented by a few inscriptions. But there is very little archaeological evidence directly for the lives of Philip and Alexander. They weren't around long enough, they didn't build enough that has survived that we can analyze. And, you don't tend to find ancient battlefields. You're very lucky if you do that sort of thing. So even for that sort of those parts of the story, you don't have much of that. So primarily, whilst we can get a good view of the cultures of the lands they're going into from the archaeology, it doesn't shape the narrative as much as we would like it to, and as it might in other topics. So we're left with these literary sources written by Greeks and Romans, or very often Greeks living under the Roman Empire, who may or may not have known the truth in the first place, who often apply standards that are a little bit strange as far as a modern audience would be concerned. So, for instance, Arrian, who's our fullest and most sober source for the exploits of Alexander the Great, tells us that he's using the court historian Aristobulus, who knew Alexander, but also Ptolemy, who later became the king of the kingdom based in Egypt in the wars of Alexander's successors. And he says that it would be particularly shameful for a king like Ptolemy to lie. So therefore, I can believe what he's saying because he's a king, and a king's bound to tell the truth. Somewhat naive, we would see that. What I've tried to do at every stage, and I know will annoy some people, but I think is the only proper way of doing this, is to look at the sources, inform the readers what we know, where this is what the source is saying, but there are reasons to be a little bit cautious in accepting it, but also admit the things we don't know and admit that there are some things where we have no idea, and that really and truly we cannot get to the personalities of Philip, Alexander, many of the men and women around them, particularly the women, who are shadowy figures always in these ancient sources. So that when there are gaps, there is a great temptation with any biography to feel, you spend years studying someone, or in this case, two people, to build up a picture in your mind of what they were really like. Now, that's fine, but when you take that and use the character you've created in many respects, your idealized Philip or Alexander, for good or bad, and then think, well, in this situation, this is what the person I think I know would have done. That's bad history. That's becoming fiction, effectively, because you are making it up, and you will always, you will turn him into whatever you want him to be. But I'd much prefer to tell the readers, look, this is what we know, this is what we think we know, this is how we know and think about all of these things, and leave it to them to judge how they fill in the gaps, but also admit sometimes there are some things we simply do not know. Pretending that we don't and just saying, well, this is what I think is the most likely, therefore, because I think it's the most likely, that's what must have happened. That is not good history. You've got to try and stick to the facts and admit when there aren't facts as well.
I loved that about the book, and I think one of the things, certainly on Ask Historians, we get a lot of questions from people who get these wrong impressions because a lot of popular histories do a lot of that speculation as fact, and I love the fact that you don't really engage with that. You say, look, this is what we know. This is, maybe we can read between the lines a little bit, but that that's what the sources that we have. That's the limit there. I was wondering in general. I mean, you have written fiction before, and you write nonfiction. It is really wonderfully presented, and it's wonderfully presented in a way that does not fall back on having to fudge the facts or fit to a narrative. To do that, it's still remarkably accurate, and obviously painstakingly researched. You have, I assume, notes upon notes. I don't know if you're a digital guy or you've got notebooks or what, but you have research, years upon years of research, notes upon notes of what you've come out of that with. How is it that you take that and turn it into that engaging story, again, without having to fall back on trying to form a narrative that may or may not be there?
I don't. I mean, I think every author, deep down, you write a book you would like to read. If you're going to enjoy doing it, and if it's properly going to work, it has to be the sort of thing. And I tend to think, well, what I want is the book I would have loved to have when I was getting interested in the subject. I hope anything of any of my nonfiction, anyone who thinks I'd like to know about Alexander the Great and Philip, or I'd like to know about Julius Caesar, or whatever, can pick it up and can follow it. And they don't need to have any prior knowledge to make sense of what you're doing. So it's a question of explaining, but also trying to present it as a story. You always hope as well you're learning. There is a craft to writing that's a little separate to being a historian. So you've got to try and do both, because obviously you can present all this information but make it so indigestible that the reader is just flooded with things they need to know, and you can't. The story bogs down. I think it's probably helped, actually, writing novels, that it makes you think about narrative and telling a story. And you can do that with history without in any way undermining the sort of historical integrity of it. But you're trying to think, well, okay, this is the story. So where do I start? What do I need to cover? And then rather than, the great instinct when you're training to do your doctoral thesis or anything like that, first chapter of almost any history book will be a survey of the sources and the existing scholarship on the subject, and you sort of dump it all down there on the page. You can't do that to the general reader. They don't know, they don't care who most of these historians are. There'll be names that nobody knows, and it's simply too much too soon. That's overcomplicated. What instead you can do is you can cover all those ideas, but you probably put the individual names of the various scholars in your notes. So anyone who's interested can go and follow them and find out. But also, if you're not interested and don't care, you can just read it. But also, you try and drip feed information as the reader needs it to follow what's happening in the story. And rather than having a whole thick chapter on this is the world in the time when Philip's born, you can talk about some things as you go along. So I think that has come. The other thing is that I think writing novels, in a sense, can get the whole filling in the gaps with imagination and my own view. It gets that out of the system. And I probably have a clearer sense of, for me personally, where fiction ends and non-fiction starts, and vice versa. It is a strange thing when you're writing. I've written some novels on the Roman period as well, and you suddenly find as a novelist you're asking yourself different questions to the ones you'd ask as a historian, because your characters have to put on clothes, they have to eat things, they have to, we think, okay, I'm in a Roman fort in northern Britain in AD 100. If I look to the right when I'm standing in this place, what would I see? You're looking and you're thinking in a different way, and your sense of timescale as well. It's a reminder that characters in a novel live the story minute by minute, and the chronology is very important. And it's a good, healthy reminder. It's actually made me ask questions that I found very useful as a historian, and that I had simply never thought about, because you don't normally bother.
Now, one of the reasons why I ask that, and it's something that I've always thought, when when reading about Alexander, and certainly I thought with this book, is Philip and Alexander have this really remarkable rise, some incredible travels and exploits. It's got a The story has just a really unsatisfying ending, doesn't it? I mean, you wouldn't write it this way. Julius Caesar, founded an empire. Napoleon had the Battle of Waterloo, which is this big loss. Alexander dies, and things kind of fracture. It's a very, I guess, anticlimactic ending in some ways. If you were writing a book of fiction, and yet, and yet there it is. Even a towering, iconic figure has that.
I think it's partly as well why movies struggle to tell the story. A, because it's so big, but also lots of the really good stuff happens in a lump quite early on. And again, as I mentioned earlier, when people talk about the warfare, they tend to focus on the big battles. And in Alexander's case, the three main ones against the Persians are all over in the first few years of the war. Then he fights one more in India. But otherwise, he's fighting nearly all the time. And he's in skirmishes, he's in raids, he's in ambushes, he's besieging cities, he's leading assaults on cities and fortified villages. He's active, he's marching, he's doing lots of stuff. But one problem is that a lot of this occurs in regions that we're not so familiar with. We don't know, in part because often you can't locate some of these villages and cities and towns of the ancient world. We just don't know where they were. But it's that sense of sort of, you're somewhere in Iran, you're somewhere in Afghanistan, you're somewhere in modern Pakistan. To the reader, it's quite hard to explain what these places were like, and what it meant traveling from one to the other. But it is, yes, it's you have those stories that ancient authors clearly struggled as well, because there's a lot of talk of what would Alexander have done. Had he not died, then where was he going next? Well, clearly the next plan was go down to the Arabian Gulf, but then was he going to turn towards North Africa, towards Western Europe? He's only in his 30s. He's doesn't show any sign, in spite of his wounds, of slowing down in any meaningful way or being in bad health in other respects. So there's almost ready for sort of, Alexander II, the next adventures type thing, and he dies, and that's it. And then there's no clear successor because he's so young. Even if he'd married, as some of his advisors said, before he set off on the expedition, and even if he'd been lucky enough to have a son with that wife almost immediately, that boy would still only have been in his early teens, too young to be secure as king by the time Alexander died. So whatever he'd done, the odds were that there was going to be a power struggle and chaos after his death. And it's part of the whole, the sense of Alexander as sort of almost an ideal Western hero, and it's this live fast, die young approach to life. He doesn't have to have the responsibility for ruling the empire he's created. He charges off, he does the conquest, he does all the dramatic bits, but he so rarely stops. And all the wonderful theories we've had over the centuries of, this was Alexander's plan, whether you go back to the sort of the view that was fashionable a century or so ago of scholars like Tarn that had this idea that Alexander wanted to create a sort of brotherhood of man and this wonderful, peaceful kingdom. He didn't have time to take any steps, even if he'd thought of an idea like that, and it doesn't sound terribly likely, and it's not really there in the sources. He has so little time. I found this when I did a biography of Julius Caesar some years ago. Lots of books focus on Julius Caesar's last few months and what he was going to do. But if you look at his life as a whole, he spent most of the second half of his life fighting and on campaign, and he didn't really have time to come up with any grand plans of what the Roman world was going to be like in 10 years' time and this sort of thing. So you compare him to Caesar Augustus, who does shape things, but he creates the system that endures very gradually and by trial and error. People like Caesar and Alexander rarely have a spare moment to stop and think and do anything. They are so busy. So again, it comes back to when you start looking at it chronologically, where they are, what they're actually doing at any time, it casts a very different light on the whole thing. And we might remember Alexander more favorably because he dies so young. He doesn't get old like Philip. He doesn't get one-eyed and limping. It's like a movie star who dies whilst they're still handsome, beautiful, whatever. They always remain that iconic thing rather than the old person who gets ill like the rest of us and gradually fails or stops being famous, stops doing all the things that's made them famous in the first place. With
Alexander the Great as James Dean.
Yeah, well, the thing is, think about it. He's unconventional. He's has a clean shaven when everybody is supposed to be manly and wears a beard. He has his hair long and shaggy, dresses a bit differently. And the whole approach to his campaigns is, in a sense, our idea of cool. He ignores perceived wisdom. He ignores the advice of his elders and more experienced people, and he's always right. He always gets away with it. He does what he wants, and he always wins. There's an element there that has sort of early roots of our idea of what a hero should be like, what the cool kid should be like, and he can stay that way. Whereas an elderly Alexander wouldn't have fitted into that. And what can you do after conquering Persia? It probably is a big problem for everyone psychologically. I mean, you suspect it, but you can't prove it. That all the Macedonians, all the Greeks, everyone who's gone on this great expedition, you've won. So what do you do next? I mean, it's like athletes who train for years for the Olympics and then they compete and then maybe they win. What do you do next? The emotional element of that must be there, but we can only speculate about it.
Do you think that kind of unsatisfying ending and that sense of potentially what he was going to do next is one of the reasons I know that you kind of seem to not be on the poisoning side of things when it comes to his actual death. But do you think that's one of the reasons why that has taken such a hold that he can't have just essentially, come down with an illness and died, that it had to have been part of some kind of plot or some kind of further narrative?
I mean, people love a conspiracy, and particularly where it involves, famous people and dramatic events like this. But we can't tell, especially at this distance. Perhaps he was, but he may just have fallen ill and died. He'd fallen ill and been thought on the brink of death a couple of times before. The same thing had happened to Philip in his life. So, although these people are very robust, these diseases can come along and kill you when you seem very healthy up until that point. But it also, again, he almost, for the story, he needs to die at this point. If he'd gone on and conquered more, there would always be a point where, he'd have to stop and consolidate, and he never really wants to do that. You get the impression that he's just itching to get on to the next conquest, and in the end, that's probably not a very good strategy for ruling an empire. So the chances are that had Alexander lived 10 more years, there would have been big rebellions, and he might well have struggled to control the territory that he'd won. In the same way that Napoleon ends up with this situation where in 1813-14 no one will negotiate with him, no one will actually talk peace treaty, because he keeps they just don't trust him not to go back to war. He might agree to something now, but he's always going to fight again, and it almost becomes the thing that's made you famous. That's what you've got to keep doing. So if Alexander had created this empire, it almost makes it more of an achievement because the empire falls to pieces and fragments so quickly. So in a sense, again, it adds to his myth. He's the man that can hold it together. He's the Macedonian king greater than any other Macedonian king. And it doesn't matter who comes next because they're never quite as good as Alexander in any respect. So again, that sort of adds to the reputation. Had he lived longer and consolidated some or part of it, that might be impressive, but how long would it actually have lasted? How impressive would that have been? It's more of a contrast when you have this dramatic and sudden and abrupt end.
And that's another thing that is just so fascinating about this, because you have the Roman Empire, which lasts for centuries. You have places like Egypt and and Persia that last for so long. Macedonia, really doesn't necessarily factor into a whole lot of ancient history, except for this remarkable few decades. With essentially that are the decades that you chronicle from the start of Philip's reign to the end of Alexander's reign, and then after that, Macedonia again doesn't really seem to factor in, at least not in that large, and oversized a way.
Well, I mean, in some respect, a lot of Alexander's conquests do remain under Macedonian rule or the rule of dynasties founded by Macedonian commanders for another couple of centuries. So, it's there, it's a big influence, but because they spend most of their time fighting each other and competing with each other, they do weaken their strength. The Romans are a very different sort of empire in that they create, they spread the idea of what it is to be Roman. They turn people into Romans, and it's a much longer term process. Alexander, while he'll plant colonies and whilst he'll set up cities that will have Greek style institutions, all the Alexandrias, but many under other names, and put settlers there, he doesn't set out in any conscious way to start to change the wider population and absorb them in. You could actually, you can almost reverse all of this, and you can see the Persians had come from one charismatic war leader who had taken over a wider area that is not quite the same as Babylonian empires, Assyrian and others, but it covers much of the same area. Those regions had civilization for far longer than most of Europe, and organized cities, organized states, and rising and fall of different empires that last. But you could, in a sense, see the Macedonians as very much like the Persians, because they'd been on the fringes of the Persian Empire. Whether they were formally part of it, they certainly may not have served under a satrap, but they were part of it. Alexander the First, the fellow we talked about a while ago who competed in the Olympic Games, he led a contingent of Macedonians with Xerxes' invasion army into southern Greece. He claims to have changed sides later on and all this sort of thing, but he's a Persian allied state. So we tend to, there's a natural way, we often think of this as, this is sort of Europe against Asia, West against East. But you could actually see the Macedonians as just a fringe people of the Persian Empire, that just as the Persians had originally done, develop a strong charismatic war leader, then take over the whole empire and create a new dynasty. without fundamentally changing the culture of many of the peoples living within that empire. I mean, there's an interesting fragmentary tablet from one of the Babylonian temples that starts off recording problems in the armies of Darius, the Persian king, before the Battle of Gaugamela, then records the defeat of the king, and then it ends, and this is only a matter of weeks, and Alexander, the King of Kings, entered Babylon. And it's, the king is dead, long live the king. This transition, the temple is still doing its thing, as it has before the Persians came along, before the Macedonians came along. Many of these communities and these traditions will just keep going, because there's a sort of veneer of empire at the higher levels, whichever dynasty, whichever country or group is controlling, and they dominate. But actually, most communities are going on doing their own thing with their own beliefs, their own laws, their own culture. There will be aspects added on from the new conqueror, but you can sort of see them as well as part of that longer history. And it's the rise and fall of different dynasties and different empires, but essentially, so much just continues. So you can look at them from different points of view.
And there's also the Greek, not just Macedonian, but the Greek influence centuries later in bringing us, among many other things, the fact that much of the Bible, you have Greek, Mark, Anthony, and Cleopatra, and the Egyptians, there are Greek. So there are many influences of there. They're just not necessarily brought into that centralized kind of Macedonian rule that they were under so briefly under Alexander.
Yes, I mean, a lot of things, it obviously helps the spread of the Roman Empire later on. And because the Romans are so enamored of Greek culture and have this sense of their own cultural inferiority, you get the Greco-Roman culture of the Roman Empire. That Greek remains the main sort of language of wider communication throughout the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Eventually will be the language of the later East Roman Empire, the Byzantines, as we call them. Even to you get a strange way in some of the Persian sources. By the time the Byzantines are around, they start talking about Alexander as the king of Rome. So the memory has changed. Oh yeah, there's some Westerner who comes and attacked us. Well, that's probably going to be a Roman, isn't it? So it's strange, but yes, you have the Persians had used Aramaic as the sort of lingua franca of their empire, rather than their own language, because it was easier to learn and more people, a wider part of the country. Aramaic continues, but Greek takes over, performs much the same role. And yes, you have, the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt is a Greek dynasty, Greek culture. Alexandria, which is always described as near Egypt, not actually in Egypt, is founded by Alexander the Great to be the new Athens. And that's how it's organized, that's how it's structured in theory. And all those ideas that will go into the library in Alexandria, it's there that the Jewish scriptures get translated into Greek and preserved in that way. But it also, you can see it in a longer strand. One of the reasons that Muslim scholars and mathematicians in the sort of early medieval period will come up with some of these innovations is that aspects of Greek culture as well as other traditions survive in that area and are preserved. And so a mingling of those different traditions of scholarship produces new ideas where similar things aren't really happening in Europe at that time. So all these trends, it does make a big difference. It's not as simple that Alexander creates this empire that then survives as something that he's sort of designed and is clearly Macedonian, is clearly Greek. But there is a huge impact on what he does, and what he does depends on what Philip's done. So there is a great tendency, and it's been the philosophy of so much of academic history for a long time, not to focus on individuals, to look at wider trends and all this sort of things. But in the end, those individuals do keep making a difference. Doesn't mean the wider trends don't matter, but people like Philip, like Alexander, they do just change things. Something about those conquests happen in the way they do because Alexander is lucky, is skillful, but is also so restless and does things so quickly and just keeps going in a way that you think a lot of other people would have said, no, I better stop and actually make sure I can hold on to what I've got. He doesn't think that way. He keeps going. So it certainly speeds the spread of Greek ideas and the mingling with other traditions as well. But it comes back to the individuals matter, and the leaders with more power tend to matter more than anyone else, which is how we report the news. It's how we understand our politics of our own day and age. But sometimes we tend to try and distance ourselves from that and think, oh no, we've got to see behind the scenes, look at the broader cultural, economic, technological aspects, and that's what shapes things. And it's simply the events just flow from that. Well, all of those things matter, but as in the daily lives we live, the personalities of the people you encounter matter an awful lot as well.
And that's, I think, a really important thing that this book does so wonderful, a wonderful job of it. It brings us into that world of Philip and Alexander. And I know that we've talked a lot about some points of that life, but I do want to highly, highly recommend everybody who's listening. It is available right now to go pick it up, and you will flesh out all of the details. There is a lot that we have not talked about because obviously we want to get people to read the book between all of these points. And Adrian Goldsworthy, thank you so much for joining us here on the Ask Historians podcast. Again, his book, Philip and Alexander, it is available now. Highly recommended for everybody. There is, I believe, a UK and a US version of it. There's also at least one translation I know of on the way for those of us who speak Dutch, and I'm sure others on the way. So wherever it is that you get books, by Philip and Alexander. And Adrian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Tyler Alderson, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.